Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to today's Dark Reading webinar, Why Effective Asset Management is Critical to Enterprise Security. It is sponsored by Panaseer and broadcast by Informa. I'm Becky Bracken, an editor with Dark Reading. I'll be your moderator for today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. First, this webinar is designed to be interactive. The dock of widgets at the bottom of your screen will allow you to learn more about today's speakers, download resources, share this webinar via social media outlets, and importantly, participate in the Q&A session that takes place at the end of our presentation. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event, and you may also download a copy of the slides via the resources widget. Toward the end of our webinar, we'll ask you to provide feedback via the survey widget, which is found at the bottom of your screen. Please take a minute to fill this out before leaving us today, as your feedback will help us prepare for our future events. Lastly, if you're experiencing any technical problems, you can click the help widget found at the bottom of your screen, or you can just type your issue into the Q&A area, and we will be glad to offer you one-on-one assistance. So with that, let's get on to our presentation, Why Effective Asset Management is Critical to Enterprise Security. Discussing today's topic is Hal Pomerantz, Principal at Adroitive Solutions, and Nick Lines, who's Product Evangelist at Panaseer. If you'd like to learn more about our speakers, you can find their bios in the Speaker Bio widget, which is found on your screen. And again, at any time, if you'd like to ask our speakers any questions, please just type those into the Q&A area. So with that, let's get started. I'd like to hand things over to Hal Pomerantz. Hal?
Great. Thank you, Becky. Appreciate it. Hey, good day, everybody. I'll just leave it at that since Becky covered all the time zones. My name is Hal Pomerantz, and I've been doing IT for a really long time. Professionally, I got started in the mid-1980s, which, makes me a bit of a dinosaur. But yes, we did have computers back in those days, and we even had networking that didn't involve, carrier pigeons, things like that. And, in the 40-odd years that I've been involved in IT, I've been a lot of different things, right? Sysadmin, network admin, security admin, systems programmer, whatever. One thing I know is that underlying everything in IT is this topic of asset management. Because if you're not keeping track of the stuff you got, right, it's really hard to effectively do IT. The old joke is, how do you know somebody stole it if you never knew you had it in the first place, right? And, it's really easy to get kind of stovepiped or kind of focused on whatever your particular IT problem is at the moment, right? You're the guy in the picture who's tending his little bonsai plant while the rest of the network's on fire behind him, right? And the only way you achieve this kind of global view of what's going on in your organization is if you can reliably say, what do I have on my network? What state is it in? And, what do I need to do to make it better? And that fundamentally is the job of asset management. And it underlies every significant IT process in your organization. You can't completely do anything IT related unless you can enumerate all of your assets, and look, IT is hard and IT asset management is hard. I'm not going to lie to you about that, but it is so critical to doing a good job, right? So, 40 years storytelling time. So I do a lot of incident response work these days. We went in to do some remediation after a significant incident for a company that shall remain nameless. And one of the things we were doing very early on was, hey, let's take a look at your backups, right? We know the attacker has been in the network for some period of time. We'd like to use your backups as a point of comparison to see, if we can detect when the attackers entered the network. Anyway, long story short, we went around the operations group and what we discovered was that everybody thought it was somebody else's job to be doing the backups, and that multiple critical devices in the organization had not been backed up for, well, let's just say months. And that was bad, right? And you ask these questions like, how did they not know that, right? How did they not realize that these critical infrastructure resources were not being backed up? The answer is nobody had that holistic view to see, A, these assets were important, and B, what their status was. By the way, who gets fired in that in that outcome, right? When you find out that like nobody's been doing backups for 6 months, who gets sacked, right? The answer is the VP of operations gets sacked, because ultimately it's their job to figure out and know the status of all of these devices. They walked the poor guy out of the building that afternoon. It's like, thanks for playing, go home. So don't be that guy, right? Don't be the guy in the picture who's tending his bonsai plant while the network's on fire behind you. Start getting a hold of, the assets in your organization, and it's a huge problem, right? So let me suggest some kind of levels that you can gradually build up your understanding of the assets within your organization. Okay, so kind of level one, right? Basic visibility, like tell me everything you got on your network, right? Just say, these are the nodes on my network, and I, vaguely know what this is. It's a Windows machine, it's a Linux machine, it's a, VPN concentrator, whatever it is, right? Just that basic level of knowledge is actually like daunting for a lot of organizations. And I guarantee you that you will find devices on your network that you had no idea that they were there. I regularly go into organizations and they tell me things like, oh, we don't have any Linux machines on our network. And I'm going, I bet you do. I will bet you a burrito that you have, Linux machines on your network that you have no freaking idea that they're there. And sure enough, I'm always right. There's always some kind of skunkworks project that kind of slid in under the door, right? And the problem with this is it's impossible to cover all your bases if you don't know that those bases are even there, right? Was doing an incident response. We believed completely scoped the situation. We knew where the attacker was in the network. We prepared this shock and awe event where we were going to, kick the attackers out of the network and salt the earth behind them. And, we executed on it. And the next day, the attackers were back in the network. And we're like, what did we miss? And turns out what we missed was this old XP machine that everybody had forgotten about. We're like, how old? Oh, it's like, XP Service Pack 2. And what is that doing on your network? And somebody finally said, oh, yeah, that was that voice response system we included for customer support. Why is it connected to the internet? Well, it's managed by this third-party external vendor, and they needed internet access. And we're like, my head explodes, right? Why were we not told about this? Bob was maintaining that, and Bob left the company about 6 months ago, and we kind of forgot about it, right? It's like, oh, great. So that's what happens when you have these, undocumented, unmanaged assets on your network. They become these kind of lingering backdoors that, adversaries can exploit. They become, sudden unintended workload for the IT department. It's just a mess. So the first thing you need to do is at least document everything that's pinging on your network. And I guarantee you, when you do that, you will find a bunch of machines that, frankly, aren't really being used or being underutilized. And you can recoup that equipment, repurpose it for other projects, and that actually provides value to the organization, right? And suddenly IT no longer being a cost center is actually putting money back into the organization. And that's a huge win, right? And so this leads into my golden rules for asset management, right? So first one is provide value, right? If you can show value at every step, then you get value back from the company, right? They're like, oh, okay. And they give you, capital, political and financial to continue with this effort, right? If you're providing value at each step. The other thing is automate it, right? You're going to say, oh, I can't possibly keep track of all the systems on my network. The network's constantly changing. Correct. Which is why you need automation in order to assist you in doing this, right? And number 3, and probably most important, document successes, right? Hey, look at all this equipment we returned to the organization, or hey, look at all this stuff that we know now that we didn't know before. That upward communication to management is key to your survival and thriving as an IT organization, right? So provide value, document it, and automate it, right? These are basic IT survival techniques, whether you're talking about asset management or anything else, okay? But it's time to get started with that at level 1 of this process, because it gets more difficult as you go up the stack, right? Okay, so that's step 1. Just like give me a basic census of everything that's on the network. And even at that step, you can provide value back to the organization. Okay, so level 2. Level 2 is now starting to get into, okay, great, but it's a Windows machine, but like what kind of Windows machine is it? Or in my case, like when I come into your organization after you've had an incident, I'm going to be asking you some uncomfortable questions. Things like, oh, I see you have, and I'm not going to pick on any particular vendors, but you have vendor XYZ's perimeter device. Can you tell me what version of software, that firmware that device is running? Because it matters, right? Because pick your vendor, for every one of their perimeter devices, there's a laundry list of CVEs with remote code executions against various flavors of that device's firmware. And if you can't answer me, that's an awkward pause in the conversation, right? Like we're on the company meet and greet where it's we, the incident response team, and it's you, the IT people, operations people, and your management sitting on this call. And when the operations people have a pregnant pause at that point when I ask that question, it gets really, really awkward, and I have to kind of jump in and say, oh, well, we'll figure that out in a little bit. It's like, but it'd be nice if you could answer that question right off the bat. And so that's what I'm saying. Get a view on like just basic operating system information that asset is running. And it matters in so many different ways, right? Obviously upgrading machines that are vulnerable, right? That's a big one. Driving out what I call fragile artifacts. You all have seen that machine in your environment that like nobody even wants to look at, because they know if you look at the machine sideways, it crashes and you spend 48 hours, trying to fix whatever problem is, and like nobody knows how to work the machine and nobody wants to go near it. Yeah, you gotta document those things, and you gotta start an upgrade path that drives them out of your network, because those kinds of brittle assets actually cause about 80 to 90% of the workload, unplanned workload for most IT organizations. And eventually that unplanned workload strangles you to death, okay? So this level of asset tracking allows you to identify those upgrade paths. It's also a really nice dashboard metric that you can report up to your management, right? They can see you're making progress. It's like, hey, we have all of these machines that are out of date, and we're migrating. And every morning they can come in and they can see that you're a few percentage points closer to your goal, right? And it's surprising if you can show consistent progress, even if that progress is slow, that management feels like, okay, these people are working. We can see, on the dashboard, the outcome of their work. And you spend a lot less time responding upwards to requests from management and more time focusing on actual work that moves the ball down the field, right? So this is where you can start, getting into good metrics that frankly, keep management off your back. Okay, so that's just like basic, OS version info, getting you on the right path. But really, if you think about it, it's not just the operating system that's important, right? It's all the applications that are running within that operating system. Not only things like, what does this machine do? Oh, well, it's the ERP system for our organization, or it's the HR system for our enterprise or whatever. But it's also all of the IT infrastructure tools, like your endpoint protection tools, your EDR, XDR tools, or whatever, right? So and this allows you to see, like, how much coverage do we have for those endpoint protection tools? Are there gaps? Can we fill in those gaps? So you start migrating more information into the asset database. So now you basically have a run book for what that system is doing, right? And in terms of returning value to the organization, there are a bunch of potential value points that you can get here. The biggest one that I find is that most organizations simply overspend on software, right? They're not sure whether they need a license for some software package, whether they already have the license or not. So they often just end up buying it again and buying redundant, software licenses and things like that. And so one of the things you get at this step is to return value to the organization by saying, look, we have all of these extra software licenses that we're paying for that we don't really need. And that ends up actually being a pretty significant savings, in my experience, for most decent-sized enterprises. You get all kinds of value about auditing, right? So and compliance, right? Are we meeting our audit requirements and things like that? It used to be like it's kind of a painful manual process. But now, if you can just go into your asset management database and say, yep, check, 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 everything's up to speed, or we have a plan for migrating it to the appropriate version. Again, it's a huge win in terms of getting back time for the IT people to actually focus on meaningful projects to improve the state of the network, rather than just like constantly fighting fires and things like that. And it also helps your proactive security posture, your vulnerability remediation, threat hunting, and things like that. If they can dive into this asset database and see areas which might be problematic, right? Don't rely on Shodan to be your asset management database, because everybody gets to see that, right? You'd like to actually have a better view of the inside of your network than Shodan does. And your threat hunting people can really substantially mine this information and look for potential threats to your organization. Okay. So now, like, you've got, assuming you've been doing this well and you've been automating it so it's kind of 99% self-updating, you've now got this pretty darn useful repository of information. But at the moment, it's kind of locked into the IT organization. Like, they're the only ones who can peer into the magic crystal ball and get this information. And what's going to happen is you're probably going to end up fielding a lot of requests from other organizations about, hey, what can you tell me about this asset or that asset? So the next level of this is integration, right? Taking this valuable collection of asset data that you have and integrating it to other processes within your organization. The hope is the shining city on the hill that you're building towards is that you create this kind of virtuous cycle amongst all of this tooling, amongst your SIM tool, your EDR, XDR tool, and all of these other telemetry tools within your organization, so that they all kind of feed into one another. Like, your asset management database tells you systems where the endpoint protection tool hasn't yet been deployed, or when your SIM tool opens up a ticket about a particular asset, the information from the asset management database auto-populates into that ticket, and you can see what the machine is, what it's running, who the owner is, and all of that stuff, right? And so all of this stuff feeds into each other, helps you identify gaps in coverage, but also, helps fill in those gaps in kind of an automated fashion. And believe me, like, when you get here, you suddenly realize, wow, the way we used to do this really sucked. You think about your life now, maybe, right? You get a trouble ticket about, a particular IP address, but then you have to go dive in and figure out, okay, whose machine is that? Like, where is it in the enterprise? What does it do? And all that stuff. But wouldn't it be great if that stuff was just already in the ticket for you and you could just begin solving the problem rather than having to do a multi-hour research project before you even begin, right? And again, you're getting back resources that otherwise would be spent unproductively, doing stuff that frankly could be automated. And this is one that kind of blows people's minds when I talk about it. But so, we're talking about all of this information kind of enriching itself in this sort of virtuous cycle. But let me tell you another thing that I frequently use to find bad happenings in an organization. It's my experience that oftentimes when a machine becomes compromised, it suddenly goes silent, right? So there's a lot of information and telemetry that's flowing out of everything on your network. And a lot of it's not particularly interesting. It's just a constant pulse of things like Windows event logs and syslog traffic from routers and Unix systems on the network and stuff. And it's there and it's mostly just noise and you kind of filter it out. But where it gets interesting is when that flow suddenly shuts off for a machine. What happened there is, okay, maybe the machine, had a problem and it's actually an operational issue. But my experience is that very often what that is an attacker who's got into the machine and is trying to suppress the artifacts of their intrusion onto the system, but they do too much and they actually end up eliminating the telemetry that's coming out of the machine completely. And so one of the things you can look for now, if everything's supposed to be feeding data into a central lake, take a look for machines that haven't reported in a while. And I guarantee you, you will find badness that way. So sometimes the absence of information is itself a clue. But you can't see that until you're aggregating all this information together and using it to build a picture of what's going on in your network, okay? Okay, so now we've got everything flowing into each other and providing this feedback loop, and everything's great. And then the real nirvana, though, is self-service. So this is the last level. This is basically taking that lake full of information and providing APIs and other windows so that other organizations besides the IT and operations organization can actually utilize this data by themselves without having to bother IT about it, right? Wouldn't you love to have an audit where basically IT didn't need to respond at all and the auditors could just simply gather the information they needed using their own self-service desktop? And wouldn't it be wonderful if you didn't have to spend all this time reporting upwards to your management to let them know about all the wonderful things that IT is doing to save the company money and protect the organization? And I'm not saying that you're going to get there instantaneously, but what I'm saying is that this pool of data gives you potential to create self-service dashboards that enable other business units within your organization to get the data they need without bothering IT. So when I was learning to be a sysadmin, right, we had a rule. If you do anything more than twice, you should write a script to do it, right? Okay. So if your group is asked by an outside organization for the same information more than a couple of times, you should create a dashboard for them or an API so that they can request that information themselves without bothering the IT organization. And if you're doing a good job integrating all of this data, you'll be able to do that very quickly and very cleanly. And it suddenly becomes this kind of self-perpetuating value where the IT people don't have to get involved, but management can still see that things are getting better, right? They can see, oh, look, our machines are 99% patched, or that upgrade project that we embarked on is 98% complete. Oh, 99% complete, right? And they don't have to keep bugging IT for this information. It's already there and good to go, right? So, this is not an overnight project, right? I mean, I'm going to be straightforward with you, and it's never going to be 100% perfect. There's always going to be weird outliers and things like that, but that's not a reason not to get started. And you can, again, with automation, and focus, you can very quickly start providing value back into the organization, which will then continue to provide inertia and momentum to get you to where you need to be, right? And really, this is important. Like I said at the beginning, you really can't do a good job at IT until you start getting a handle on these asset issues. Trust me, I've been there. I've been in organizations that have done this well. It's been great. I've been in organizations that have done this poorly, and it's been a nightmare. So trust me on this. Focus on your asset management. You'll get a lot of benefit out of it very quickly. And I am running out of time, so I'm going to just say thanks for listening. My contact information is in these slides, as you can see. And as Becky said, you can download the slides, and feel free to contact me even after the webinar if you have questions. I'm happy to give you some emails back. But for now, I got to hand it over to Nick. And Nick is going to talk about how Panaseer can give you a leg up on some of these projects that I've already talked about. So Nick, over to you.
Great, thanks, Hal. And yeah, that was great. I like the way you've set this out into almost 5 levels of maturity as well. I think that's it's a realistic way that people need to start, and it's a journey that people need to go on. Echo completely what you said there, which is it does sound daunting. It can be daunting, but that's not a reason not to do anything. I think get this right, in particular the automation, and it stops, as you've mentioned throughout, this idea of freeing people's time up. So they're no longer doing things by rote. They're no longer answering questions. They're enabling that self-service. It's a cheesy, but that's a nirvana they want to get to. So yeah, getting there is absolutely something we can help to do. So Panaseer, what we do and what we've been championing for the last decade is this idea of continuous controls monitoring. So rather than taking the default approach for security, which is, hey, what we need to do is there's another threat, so we should buy another tool. We're actually saying people have actually got the tools they need to protect themselves, typically, with a variety of ways. But what you should be doing is making sure you're using what you've got better, and making sure that the things that you think you've got that are deployed and protecting you are actually working across all of your assets. And coming back to Hal's point, if you don't know what your assets are, you don't know if they're protected or not, and that's where it typically bites you. So, a bit of context for what we try and do. If you look at this idea of avoidable control failures, as I mentioned, majority of organizations have got security tools coming out of their ears, to coin a phrase. Anything between, certainly every organization I speak to has got between 10 and, in extreme outliers, 80 security tools that they see as strategic for their enterprise. Across those, it is very, very difficult to make sure that you are managing everything that you should be doing. What we're trying to say is don't buy another tool for this. Actually, make sure the tools you've got are doing the right job. We've mentioned this idea of everyone wants to know more about security, and CISOs regularly say that they are the most inspected role within an organization. If you look at what's happening with regulations in the US, there's the SEC have recently rolled out their cyber disclosure rules as of last December, which now everyone is having to report against. And if you're sad like me and you want to see what people are doing, have a look at some of the 10Ks that have been filed. This is the annual reports that people have been filing. And even some of the 8Ks, that's the exceptional items that people have had to report to the SEC on something that's happened that they've had to report on. Again, Microsoft is a good example of that. Have a look at the Equifax 10K. There's some interesting stuff in there. Point is that the security team is getting asked, hey, help us to make our filings, help us to show that we are compliant against external and internal scrutiny. For that, you've got increasing audit demands. With increased regulation, you've got increased audit, you've got increased eyes on on everything you're doing. And all of this starts from that asset database. If you don't know what your asset database is, you're going to be in trouble. And again, IT has traditionally had a problem of communicating key risks and being able to talk the language of business. We're very, very good at being able to talk and explain something technically. Actually translating that into what that means for the business and what the business should be doing and how the business should be investing to improve their cybersecurity is not necessarily coming through. If you bring in the, some of the compounding factors here, I've already mentioned this idea of disparate data and tools. You start getting 30, 40, 50 systems in there, all of which are trying to clamor for attention to say, hey, I'm your latest XDR. I've found something great on your network. You should be looking at me. While your email system's saying, by the way, there's a phishing attack going on. You should be looking at me. It simply is overwhelming for both SOC and IT departments to try and keep on top of that. These teams are overworked. I think we all know how many millions of open or cybersecurity jobs there are throughout the world that are never going to be fulfilled right now. Yes, there's training programs and there's great stuff happening on that, but the answer can't be to simply throw more resources at this. Compounded by that, Hal was talking about this idea that, you don't know what's going on. You've got these skunk works, things are spinning up because business demands agility. And a lot of organizations are actually empowering their business leaders to make their own decentralized IT decisions. With IT decisions and with IT ownership should come accountability and responsibility for cybersecurity. That doesn't necessarily happen. And we often see organizations that don't actually manage to decentralize their IT security in the same way. And then, as Hal mentioned, a lot of people are spending far too much time on these manual control assessments. We've been doing a survey of security leaders through a market-wide survey company the last 5 years and found in that time that people are telling us that between 40 and 60% of their security team's time is spent gathering data for audit, presenting to audit, and presenting the data on what they're doing with their security tools, which frankly is horrific. Of course, we have the answer. I hate doing this, but automated continuous controls monitoring is absolutely something that can help you here. It's got to be automated, as Hal was saying. You've got to free up your team's time to do things. It's got to be monitoring not just the assets, but the controls on those on those assets, and it's got to be continuous. It's no use doing this as a point-in-time exercise. It's an evolution that we're seeing in quite a few 10Ks actually reporting this. That's the annual report you have to make to the SEC and have to disclose what you're doing around your around your cybersecurity processes, procedures, management, and governance. And again, quite a few are saying they're doing some form of continuous audit or continuous compliance. And interesting to see how that's playing out. I'm going to skip over this one for the minute and come back to it if I've got time, because actually what I think this audience is interested in is how we work. Because again, I've talked about, the challenge here. What do we actually do? Fundamentally, what we do is quite a lot of what Hal described actually at levels 1 through to 5. We automate all of this. We're not another security tool. We simply collect the data from your existing security tools. As Hal said, this idea of integration at level 4, that's what we do. And then we provide dashboards as a result of this. I'm jumping ahead of myself there. But we collect the data from your EDR tools, from your vuln scanners, from your SCCM solutions, from your management solutions, from your cloud CASBs, from your CSPMs. We bring all of that stuff into one place and we create asset inventories. Now that sounds like it's something you can just do in Power BI, and yes, you certainly can do it in Power BI, or we've seen it done in Excel. We've seen a variety of different approaches. Our legacy and our history is quite proud as data scientists, and getting that right and getting that to the point where you've got an inventory that you can show is correct is quite non-trivial. We know that because from our customers, as Hal said in his introduction, we start off down this line and we pretty much guarantee that we'll see an organization discover 50% of the assets they knew about. Actually, on 50% on top of that were unknown, up to 150% were unknown. So in some instances, some people have thought they've got, 50,000 devices. They've actually got 75,000 unknown devices, giving them an inventory of 125,000. It is that serious an order of magnitude. And yes, of course, with that sort of order of magnitude, the first response is disbelief. And that's why we spend a lot of time going through, making sure we've got it right and actually getting to provability, because we've got traceability on every asset, every part of our pipeline. So we can show you that asset that we've created is actually there, does exist, and needs something doing to it. Next thing we do is enrich. So bring all this data in. If we brought data in from the CMDB, that's great, because the CMDB is often a good source of information. Often the CMDB can be slightly out of date, and it won't be, certainly won't be covering all the assets. And what we can do is enrich that, enrich all that data to say, right, this device here, or this asset, where is it? And we can reason on where is it and where its location is on a variety of different fields, whether it's IP address or something else. We can be, as rich as possible on that. But fundamentally, we can then work out business processes that an asset is involved in, its place in the organization, who is accountable for it, who is responsible for the security on it, and ultimately who owns it. That means that you can actually start to drive an organizational change where people understand their responsibilities against the assets they own. Of course, understanding the business context, whether it's involved in something that's, displaying the internal canteen menu, probably isn't that high a risk if that's got an open vulnerability on it. If it's on your production payment system and has an external IP address, that is something that's a lot more critical. So that's where we can help you understand your risk and prioritize on this. We then measure this. So we measure everything we collect, all the control statuses on all your assets. Control status is simply whether the tool is doing the job it's supposed to be or not, and then measure against your own policies. So if you've got a policy that, as Hal says, no one's going to aim for, well, you might aim for 100%, you're not going to get there. But if you've got a policy saying that 98% of our critical assets need to be protected by EDR, and that EDR needs to be up to date within the last week, having the version information, as Hal was saying, is in level 2, that is absolutely something that we do out of the box. We can also then codify that against your risk appetite and your risk tolerance. So if you're willing to say, yes, our aim is 98%, but we'll tolerate 95, but beyond that, actually, we can't do it. That's where the red, amber, green measurement comes in. You can see what's going on. We map all that against common frameworks, so the likes of the NIST CSF or CIS V7 or V8. So you can see and you can tell auditors how they're doing. What that allows you to do is actually come back to a score to show your overall performance, how you as an IT organization and security organization are improving from where you were, the impact you're making on the individual initiatives that you have. And those initiatives, actually, it was interesting Hal said about self-service at level 5, this idea of giving audit response to this, audit access to this and giving them their own dashboard. What audit can do is they can say, right, we want to know how the coverage is for active leavers, which again, how many accounts are active that shouldn't be active because that person has left and the HR system has been updated, but there's been a delay on the IT system. Again, it doesn't sound it's not the sort of thing that's going to set people on fire in security. It's not chasing bad guys through the network, which everyone loves doing. It is finding out where there's errors in your process. We always find that is an issue with organizations. What audit can do is they can go and look at that themselves and say, actually, we can see we've got an ongoing issue where this figure has constantly been bubbling up from, I don't know, 10 to 100, down to 0, back to 100, down to 10, whatever. They can actually set themselves a watch on that and actually set something that automates looking at that every day, tracks against how they're doing, gives them a target to get that down to 0, and create a ticket as a result of it that actually takes someone from the IT department to go and do something with that ticket. That's the idea of translation into something and then acting to do something. This idea of, I've talked about remediation there and tracking and driving things down. We've talked about assigning ownership there. We've talked about responding to regulations and notifications there. All of this can only work if you actually have that strong auditable quality data that comes from being underpinned by solid data science. I know I'm laying that on a bit thick, but we've talked with organizations who've tried to do this themselves and struggled. They've taken different approaches using, some good technology out there. But frankly, the data science is quite hard, and we like to think we're quite good at it. What does this allow us to do anyhow? I'm going to skip back one here. And what this typically allows you to do is prioritize. I've mentioned prioritize. So you can actually have this continuous controls compliance with the right insights. It allows you to collaborate working across your teams and actually make a change throughout the organization. By prioritize, we've found that controls coverage typically increases by up to 50% within an organization. IT audit and productivity actually goes up by around 40%. So we've had organizations that are saying they are spending 2 of their 5 days a week in a security team working on audit. That can simply disappear. That drops down not to 0, but between 2 and 5% in our organizations. And we've had customers telling us that rather than being a little adjunct to the security organization or the IT organization, we are core and central to their strategy. So that's the sort of thing that Panaseer can help you do. Again, we also feed back into external systems. So if you have a CMDB like ServiceNow, we can help you improve that. So once you've found these great things, once you've got that asset inventory that's in the Panaseer world, you can feed that out to improve your strategic systems, the likes of ServiceNow, as I've already mentioned, and improve that asset inventory within there by 2.5 to 10 times, because that is often what drives so many other processes within the organization. We know we're not just sitting on our own here. Realize I've absolutely rattled through that. More than happy to take questions. You're getting the sort of flavor for what we do there. I haven't mentioned dashboards. I should have mentioned dashboards. Everything we do ultimately rolls up to a dashboard. There's metrics that cover your controls coverage, that roll up to your dashboards, that can be sliced, diced, and filtered in any way with any dimension you want. That gives you the ability to understand your coverage, your effectiveness, and improve your performance. So, love to hear any questions from you. If you want to know more, please visit panaseer.com. As said, my name is Nick Lyons. You can find me on LinkedIn, or I'm more than happy for you to contact me directly, just nick.lyons@panaseer.com.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nick and Hal, both of you, for that deep dive into asset management. Before we move into Q&A, we've got some great questions on deck. I just wanted to direct everyone's attention once again to the webinar survey, which is available at the bottom of your presentation window, and ask you to please fill that out before leaving us today. With that, let's get on to our Q&A. Again, anyone can ask any questions they'd like of our expert panelists. Just type your questions into the Q&A window. And I think a good place to start is Mohan Cox. And, I've heard a lot of people say, even if you've just got it down on a legal pad, just asset management varies quite a bit from organization to organization. So Mohan asks, do you have any recommended tools or templates to get a better understanding as to what an effective asset management system might look like? And Hal, why don't we kick off with you so you can give us sort of a legacy look at sort of how it might look and how it might evolve as you improve your systems.
Yeah. So, look, there's an awful lot of ad hoc solutions out there, and I've been through a lot of different organizations, and there have been a lot of homebrew solutions. And the answer is, to some extent, whatever works for you. You're probably not going to get it exactly right in the first iteration, right? So what's important is that you start, and you begin collecting the data, and you begin trying to utilize that data within your organization, and that's inevitably going to reveal, gaps in your initial architecture that you'll then have to, probably do another generational iteration to fully smooth out. So that being said, there are a number of industry standards out there, and Nick could probably do a better job of specifying those because he's more deeply immersed in that. But you go to places like NIST and MITRE, and standards organizations like that. there's ISO standards that cover asset management and things like that. And you will find out there, a number of very deep, technical papers that outline, asset management strategies for different levels of organization. Nick, give me some examples.
I was going to say, you've got NIST CSF, I think we've mentioned, we've got CIS. One thing that I'm going to mention, actually, which is a slight adjunct to that, which is NIST themselves are putting together this task force and have created a standard called OSCAL, which is the Open Security Controls Assessment Language, which, again, I know we're talking about asset management, and I'm pivoting to talk about security here, but that's my passion. OSCAL is certainly something that I'd be looking at. NIST CSF version 2 has just come out as well. There's great assets on that, and some really, really good guides for how to get started and best practices. It's a really good piece of work. What I think is good about the latest evolution of NIST CSF is they've always had this idea of 5 functions, or, from identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. What they've now added across that is they've added another function that they call govern. And that govern layer goes across all of those 5 existing things they've got. Reason for mentioning that is I think governance is something that is going to get more and more attention in IT and security world, because frankly, sometimes we're not very good at it. So I think that's, that's a very welcome evolution.
Excellent. Thank you both. I hope that was helpful for you, Mohan. I think Vikram also asked an important question, and he wants to know that isn't the identification and mapping process itself opening up a vulnerability due to its use of an SMNP protocol? Is that the only way to identify assets? Is that true? Is this opening up a new attack surface? Let's get Hal to weigh in on this first, and then we'll go to Nick.
Look, I mean, certainly, the classic discovery protocol has been SNMP, but honestly, I find that SNMP is not that useful across all the kinds of devices in your network. It's good for your network devices, your routers, your switches, and things like that. But they have SNMP enabled for management anyway, so you're not really opening up a new attack surface there. I like what Nick was saying in his part of the presentation. You've got information about assets from a whole lot of other sources in your organization. So, your vulnerability assessment tools, your EDR, your endpoint protection tools, right? They already are funneling information about your assets into their localized pod of information. And you can mine that information and kind of do passive discovery off of those sources of information to begin populating your asset database. Yes, SNMP helps, pinpoint your network devices, but there's a whole other set of information that's already in your organization that you can mine as well. And what you'll find is, there's still going to be gaps, and you're probably going to have to come up with some of your own kind of local automation to fill in those gaps. But you probably already have the information sitting in different buckets. It's just going and finding those buckets and using the information appropriately.
Yeah, I'd echo
Nick, what do you have to? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd echo that exactly. We don't actually do anything with SNMP. Hal's basically said everything was going to sound. So I wrote down the word passive. So we basically use information from vuln scanners. We take information from EDR. The likes of Microsoft MDE, for example, now doesn't just do EDR. It also does asset discovery on the network. So if you've got IoT or OT devices that aren't managed, or even unmanaged devices, MDE will now report that back, and that's available. That's something we also ingest. As Hal says, everything out there has an API. All these different data sources have an API. We pull that in and then try and make sense of it. And the point you made about gaps being filled as well, you have to do that by process, local process. we try and fill those gaps using this this technique, well, this stuff we've got called business logic, which does try and apply and reason across the data we've got that we've then normalized, deduped, and correlated to say, actually, this is what the reality is. And of course, that's all configurable and flexible throughout the tool that we provide.
Yeah, and let me also throw a shout out to things like your intrusion detection system and your security monitoring system. You know, like if you're using something like Snort or Zeek or whatever, those things are doing passive device recognition based on the data they see flowing over the wire, and it's an incredibly rich source of just basic information about things that are talking on your network. So, in the olden days, we'd go around and we'd broadcast ping out a collision domain and, try and gather information. But that doesn't work so well anymore. A lot of devices simply won't cough up any information. So you're relying on these sources of information that are actively monitoring the network. And then you can suck that information out of them and use it to begin creating this body of knowledge.
Great. Speaking of body of knowledge, we have another really good question about from Vikram again, sort of about a unified view. There's asset information across several different platforms and tooling, EDR, MDM, patching. Let's start with what the value is in consolidating all of those data streams, and then maybe get into the nuts and bolts of how one might begin to do that. How?
Yeah, I mean, so this is level 4, right? This is the integration of all of these, and it's absolutely useful because it's where you begin allowing one tool to see the gaps that the other tools don't see. It's like, oh, we're backing up everything, really, because I see the backup software is deployed on these machines, and we've gotten good backups from these machines, and yet here's 3% of your machines where the backups have been failing and nobody's dealt with it. And by the way, here's another 15% of machines that haven't ever had a backup run on them at all, right? And how do you see that? You see that because, like, for example, your EDR tool is reporting, hey, I'm live and active on this system, but what I don't see is, your backup client or whatever, right? Or the backup tool saying, hey, I backed up this list of systems, and the EDR tool is saying, hey, I'm monitoring this group of machines, and the vulnerability assessment tool is saying, hey, I found these machines on the latest vulnerability scan. And I guarantee you that right now, those 3 lists of machines don't match up, right? And so your job is to take those 3 lists and normalize them so that everybody's seeing everything, right? And doing what they should be doing.
Great. Nick, do you have anything to add to that?
That's exactly, yeah. I mean, if you ask EDR, hey, how are you doing? It'll say, yeah, I'm covering 100% of the devices that I know about. And it doesn't know about the devices it doesn't know about. Ask any team, they'll have a different view. Again, you go and ask the SOC saying, hey, how many machines do we have? Or how many machines do we need to protect? And they'll say, oh, we've got 11,000 because that's how many we got system logs for, or we're collecting logs for. Ask EDR team and they'll say, oh yeah, we've got 7,000 because that's how many we're deployed on. The interesting thing is you can then pull all that together, but it does get, as soon as you start going beyond 2, 3, 4, 5 tools, combining that in a meaningful way is actually quite challenging. But the value is absolutely there, because when it comes to a failure or audit, saying, right, how many of these have we actually got, please? You've got to be able to stand up and say, I can tell you we've got this many devices, and this is how we're protecting them, and this is how we've done over time, and this is how we're improving, and these are the matters requiring attention that we are now currently addressing. Because audit don't want to hear that you've actually got 17 different answers to the same question. So, the value is absolutely there. It's a great question. Thanks, Vikram.
Great. Okay. Let's see. Now, we have one last question from Scott, and I think this is sort of a great place to land on, and he wants to know specifically about small business. But I think that it's worth having a quick conversation about how small business can, and medium-sized business can itself start to sort of wrap its hands around this. Hal, do you have any specific advice for your SMB audience?
It's hard, right? Like, you're a small business, and your business is making widgets, and it's not, your core business is not IT. And ultimately, I think you have to look at outsourcing this. If it's not your core business, talk to, reliable, MSP. And one of the things that I think you should, ask, when you're interviewing different MSPs is, like, you're going to protect me from, negative day threats and all the buzzwords and stuff like that. But can you tell me all the machines on my network and what they're doing, right? Can you answer these asset management questions that, as Nick points out, audit's going to, and compliance are going to come after you for, particularly if you're in a regulated industry, like you're like a small medical office or something like that, right? And so I think at a certain threshold, this is something that you outsource to a reliable firm. It's only for decent sized businesses where it's cost effective to do IT in-house. Do you begin, talking about that? And maybe that's never going to be you if you're a small business. I mean, maybe it's just worth it to buy it as a service from another provider, because they get economy of scale and they know how to manage this and they know how to automate it and so on and so forth.
Good point. Nick, we'll give you the last word on this.
Yeah, I absolutely, sorry, it sounds like I'm a bit of a parrot here, but I'll absolutely echo what Hal said there. The answer is really for small businesses, I think it's MSSPs. And I love the point that Hal made, ask the question not against the 0 days and all the stuff that everyone's, so concerned about. It's the boring stuff, which is, look, you tell me you're going to protect all my endpoints. Who's accountable if you miss an endpoint? Is that my fault for not telling you? Is it your fault for not knowing about the endpoint? Who's accountable for that? What's going to happen? Because that is where people get bitten. It's in the lack of coverage, not the lack of buying tools. So yeah, I completely agree with Hal on that one.
Great. I want to thank you both. We do have a couple other questions that are product specific, and I wanted to let everyone know that Nick or someone will respond to you offline with your specific questions. All of those will be submitted to Nick and his team. I want to thank Hal and Nick, both of you, for your time and your deep expertise on this topic. We very much appreciate it. We also want to thank our sponsor, Panaseer, as well as everyone in our audience. We very much appreciate your attention and your participation. I wanted to let you all know that within the next 24 hours, you will receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. You can feel free to invite your colleagues who might not have been available to listen to the live event. So with that, we will let you know that this webinar is copyright 2024 by Informa. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by Dark Reading and Panaseer, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. On behalf of our guest Panaseer, I'm Becky Bracken. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time. Have a great day. We'll see you at a future Dark Reading event.